So I just want to start out by talking about the quote that I have here from the 1939 publication, We or Our Nationhood Defined, by M.S. Goldwalker, where he says that foreign races must lose their separate existence to merge into the Hindu race, or may stay in the country, wholly subordinated to the Hindu nation, deserving no privileges, far less any preferential treatment, not even citizens' rights. And my paper explores the not so much the implications of what it is to be a Hindu, but the understanding of Hinduism and Hindus, of what it means to be, what the origins are of people who are not Hindu, and this is very important in terms of modern politics, because the current Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, is a member of, he is also a member of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the RSS. Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh means the Indian Volunteer, or rather the National Volunteer Society. And it's a, it organizes into all sorts of cultural organizations as well as political organizations, some of which try to convert people to Hinduism. I mean, I know we're used to the idea of Hinduism not being a converting religion, but in this case, they argue that they need to convert particularly Muslims, but also Christians in India, to Hinduism because their ancestors were originally Hindu. And so it's worth, since they're taking that position, it's worth looking at what the origins, what they believe, and what Hindus have believed in the past were the origins of non-Hindus. And what's interesting about this, in a way, is not the presence of many narratives about this, but the absence of them. If you go back to the earliest Sanskrit texts in the Vedas, which were written probably in the late 2nd millennium BCE, and a little bit into the early 1st millennium, these Sanskrit texts are based to a great extent on oral tradition at a time when the Arya, the Indo-European speaking tribes moving into India from the Northwest, were settling down and regarding the indigenous population as the other, and therefore not encountering the other as a group from outside India, but actually as a group inside India with which they had to deal. And that led to an understanding that was really based off order within their own society. And let me get onto some terms here. Their own society was seen as it was according to this order of Varna, the Varna Shrama Dharma, the caste, or actually it literally means color ranking custom. The 4 familiar castes, major castes that we talk about, the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, the Brahmins being of course, the priestly caste, the Kshatriyas, the warrior caste, the Vaishyas, the caste of farmers, and the Shudras, the caste of laborers. And within these castes were endogamous birth groups, the jati, the what we often call subcastes or birth groups. And this is all well known. It's part of, it's still an issue in Indian society today, a major form of social organization. But this was emerging during this period. And so if something wasn't in, if a group was not considered to be in the Varnashrama Dharma, then it was considered to be other and had to be explained somehow. And so the term that arises, the terms of inclusion in the Vedas, particularly Arya, which means pure, and from which we get the infamous word Aryan, and Manusa, the descendants of Manu, who is supposed to be the founding figure of humanity. And then there's terms of exclusion. Originally, there's the Dasa, which are the groups of people in India, the indigenous groups, who it seems eventually merged into the Varnashrama Dharma system to be probably mainly a Shudra, but also possibly in other castes higher up. And then there's the derogatory term Lecha, which was used after they had settled down in northern India, after the Arya had settled down in northern India, to describe groups outside the Varnashrama Dharma, including people who may have been outside India. And then there's a more neutral term that arises in the really in the 3rd century BCE in response to the invasion of Alexander the Great, and that is Yavana. And Yavana is actually derived from the Greek term for Ionia. So it's a geographical term. And this was a problem for Hindus for a long time, because they had to increasingly deal with groups that came in from the outside who were not part of the Varnashrama Dharma, and therefore were considered to be ritually impure, but on the other hand, were at the same time more powerful often than the members of the Varnashrama Dharma. And this includes the Greeks, the Persians, and then later on Muslims, and finally the British, all of whom had to be dealt with in terms of them being more powerful than the members of the Varnashrama Dharma. So the explanations that arise, and these arise actually mainly during the period of Muslim rule, to explain the origins of non-Hindus, are that all people were originally Hindu. And here they look back to the birth story of Purusha. This is a myth from the Vedas, where this is the primordial body, which is broken up into the different Varna, the head going to Brahman, becoming the Brahmins, the arms becoming the Kshatriyas, the torso, the Vaishyas, and the legs being the Shudras. And the understanding in some of the commentary of in the Middle Ages, and there's not really much of it. There's not one of the main issues to take away from this is really that they're not talking a lot about origins for the most part. But when they do, there's a tendency to regard the people who don't fit into the Varnashrama Dharma as having originally been members of that system, but having fallen away somehow. And the reason they fell away was because we are in the Kali Yuga, a dark age, which began around 5,000 years ago and will continue for hundreds of thousands years more. And it's a dark age where we fall away from the proper dharma, from the proper customs that we should adhere to. Now, I'm going to skip some of the, well, let me talk a little bit about what happens later on. When the British arrive, they the encounter between British intellectuals, administrators often, who are wanting to find out more about Hindu law and Hindu customs, leads to several discoveries. And one of them is, of course, the understanding of the relationship of the Northern Indian languages to the European languages, and the concept of the Indo-European language family. And that has an enormous effect both on Indian intellectual thought and on European thought. And the result is that Brahmins, particularly Indian intellectuals, start to reassess their origins in terms of the idea of what in the 19th century is considered an Aryan invasion of northern India. And so they start to see it much more in racial terms than they did earlier on. I wouldn't say that they saw it in doctrinal or religious terms specifically earlier on, because Hindu beliefs were not particularly focused on doctrine. They were focused on inclusion in the community or exclusion from the community. But once the British come, once you have this what's often called the Hindu Renaissance of the early 19th century, they are now understanding their origins much increasingly in racial terms, and see themselves in an honored position because they are the Aryans, a term that then is appropriated by Europeans to describe the entire Indo-European linguistic family, and conflate it with biological race and culture. And this leads to all sorts of debates arising in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Some Indians try to use their Aryan identity and their supposedly white origins to assert their equality with people of European descent in a very racist environment across much of the world. One significant example, far from India, was the Sikh immigrant to the United States, Bhagat Singh Thind, who lost an appeal before the Supreme Court, where he argued that he should not be deprived of citizenship, as was happening, because he was Aryan, because he should be considered white. But at the same time, the discovery of the Indus Valley civilization in the early 20th century was leading to a reassessment about where Hinduism's origins came from. The emphasis in the 19th century had been on the Sanskrit texts, on the Vedas, the Brahmanas, the laws of Manu, and so on, which were understood to be part of the Sanskritic civilization that had been established by the Aryan immigrants into northern India around 1500 BCE. But later on, with the discovery of the Indus Valley civilization, there are, of course, we've never been able to translate the writing on the seals that have been uncovered there. But there are some indications, some tantalizing hints of elements of Hinduism that may have been around in the Indus Valley civilization. A particularly famous example of this is the Indus Valley seal, depicting a seated figure who appears to be in the lotus position, and the meditative position that is so well known in Hinduism and Jainism and Buddhism. And here it is up here, this on the right of this frame. So then we get into the early 20th, as we're getting into the early 20th century, though, and the Indian national movement is becoming more robust in its opposition to British rule, and people are thinking about what the future of India will look like, you start to get a Hindu nationalist movement within the Indian nationalist movement that breaks with the normal practice that had been the case in earlier centuries of not being an expansionist religion, not wanting to proselytize. And this organizations such as the Hindu Mahasabha and the RSS start to actively go out and recruit try to reconvert, as they call it, Muslims in particular to Hinduism. And this leads to all sorts of social unrest, which the particularly conservative British authorities exploit to argue for their remaining in Britain. Winston Churchill was rather pleased, for instance, when the Mopla riots broke out in response to Hindu Mahasabha attempts to reconvert Muslims to Hinduism. And this leads us down to today, where the Bharatiya Janata Party, the ruling party at the moment in India, has close connections with the RSS, and is takes the attitude, really, or a lot, the RSS certainly takes the attitude that in order to be a fully Indian in culture, you have to be Hindu. Now, of course, as I get into in this paper, particularly in the early part, this all begs the question about what it means to be a Hindu. And the RSS and the BJP and most Hindus today accept that there is a cohesive religion called Hinduism. But in reality, of course, recent scholarship has demonstrated that that is really a fairly recent construction, and partly in resulting from the British occupation of India. In other words, the concept of being Hindu is more something that was imposed on the indigenous religious traditions of India from the outside, rather than something that came from within Hindu culture itself. And I think with that, I'll wrap up and entertain any questions people have.